My name is Kim Dorman. I serve as the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Princeton Public Library, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here on this really beautiful evening where it is reasonably pleasant in our community room for an author talk with Joan Maloof about her beautiful book, Nature's Temples, The Complex World of Old-Growth Forests. I want to start by thanking you all for joining us, both in person in our community room and virtually on YouTube. This evening's program is being recorded. I'd also like to thank the Friends of Herrontown Woods, Friends of the Drew Forest, Princeton University Press for their support and partnership. Also, our beloved Labyrinth Books. You can purchase a copy of both of Joan Maloof's books, Nature's Temple and Treepedia, from their bookshop, and they're also available here this evening. Treepedia is $17 and Nature's Temple is $20. Tonight's multi-platform event will run for about 1 hour, and there will be an opportunity for audience members in our community room to ask questions. If you have a question, simply raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you. Just one housekeeping note I'd like to mention before we get started. This room is T-Coil enabled, so if you have a T-Coil enabled device, you can turn it on now. That also means that everybody who is speaking, we ask that you speak through a microphone, so just remember that I will be bringing the microphone if you have a question. It's now my pleasure to introduce Joan Maloof, Professor Emeritus at Salisbury University. She founded the Old Growth Forest Network to preserve, protect, and promote the country's few remaining stands of old growth forest. She spends her time lecturing, writing, visiting forests. I love that, Joan. Assisting private landowners and supporting local groups trying to protect community forests from development. Please join me in welcoming Joan Maloof.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Such a beautiful time of year, right? We watch the buds come out on the trees, and now the leaves have expanded, and we see this green color everywhere, and we get to celebrate how important the trees are in our lives. I'm an ecologist, and what interests me is how life just springs from the earth. So if you take a piece of earth and leave it alone, depending on where it is, what the rainfall is, what the temperature is, what the bedrock material is, you will have some sort of ecosystem. And where we are, right here in New Jersey, what that ecosystem is going to be is a temperate deciduous forest. So this spot where we are used to be a forest, an old growth forest. And if we took away this building and left it alone, it would probably become a forest again. And so as an ecologist, that's what fascinates me, and not just the trees in the forest, but all the other organisms that also live there, live on the trees and in the trees and with the trees, and they all depend on each other. So ecology is so fascinating to just look at what the earth makes and to look at the tapestry of that life. And so that's what charges me up. And here I am in a forest looking at some little insects in a mud puddle, and when I see these forests being cut down, it really reaches my heart, because I know it's not just the trees that are being removed, but it's habitat for all those other organisms. And as a scientist, I felt a little bit powerless in how I could stop this. And so in the early 2000s, I started writing about it instead. So here I am 20 years ago working on my first book, Teaching the Trees, which is really a natural history book talking about the organisms that depend on the individual trees, like the leaf miners that depend on the holly leaves, and the parasitic insects that depend for their lives on the leaf miners, or on the 8 types of insects that are only found on sycamore tree leaves. So when you take those trees out, the hollies and sycamores, whatever, you're also removing their partners. And this one was more was trying to reach the foresters more with this one. I felt like, oh, if they really got it, then they'd stop what they're doing. And it has some heart in there too, and some poetry, because this work is heart work. In that book, there was a chapter called Old Growth Air, where I visited an old growth forest and talked about the air quality in that forest, because the forest, not only do they clean the air of the pollutants, they literally hold on to the pollutants on their leaves. And I'm not talking just carbon dioxide, I'm talking all the nitrous oxides and the sulfur oxides and the particulates. Every type of air pollution you can think of is filtered out by the leaves, and the leaves can actually transform those pollutants. And so the air is very clean in the forest, and of course there's the oxygen that the trees are making. But more than that, these living things we're talking about, the trees, the leaves, the fungi in the soil, they're emitting compounds, chemical compounds that we hardly understand, that go into our lungs when we inhale, into our bloodstream, and how are they changing us? We know they are, but we don't really understand it all yet. All we can tell so far is really the vital signs. Oh, our blood pressure goes down. Oh, our stress hormones go down. Oh, our immune cells are bumped up. Our blood sugar goes down. So we know the forest is having an effect, even if we don't quite understand it yet. So after Teaching the Trees came out, the number one question I got was, where's that old growth forest? People wanted to see a forest that had never been cut, and it can be hard to find them because there was no directory for that. You know, you can find all the Italian restaurants in their town by Googling Italian restaurants near me, but you couldn't really even find old growth forests then. So I decided to visit one old growth forest in each of the 26 eastern states to let people know where those forests are and to share what I saw there and to make the case for these old growth forests. And that was the book Among the Ancients. So during that, I learned a lot of things about old growth forests, and they're very different than the western old growth forests. So how many of you have been to western old growth forests like the Redwoods or sequoias? And yeah, beautiful. And usually when I ask people then how many have been to an eastern old growth forest, there's fewer hands. But some of us have. Yep, they're out there. They look very different. There I am hugging a tree in an eastern old growth forest that's about 350 years old. So they're out there, but there's only about 1% left. And they look different. You have to kind of know what to look for. Size is one, the shape of the trees in the canopy is another, and the down wood, actually, you'll find more dead trees in these old growth forests. So I also learned during that time about the history of the old growth forests in this country. So that top left graph shows the approximate area of virgin forest in 1620. So, just as the European settlers were coming, our nation was mostly old growth forest. Of course, some of that forest had been knocked down by tornadoes or windstorms or ice storms, and native peoples that lived there had clearings, and there were some crops being grown, but the majority of the forested area was old growth. And then the white areas are areas where trees don't normally grow because it's either true dry or a prairie situation. But then those early European settlers, by 1850, the middle graph, they were cutting like mad. And they were exporting a lot of this timber to the other nations that already had cut their trees. In fact, on the Mayflower, when the pilgrims got off, they were told to load the hull of the ship with timber to send back to Europe. And all the ships that were being built and the houses and the railroad tracks and on. And by 1920, you can see the effect of all that cutting. And by then, we were starting to cut the western forest too. And today, the estimates are the 1% I mentioned left in the east and 5% left in the west. And I think the reason there's a little more out west is because the conservation organizations kind of woke up and saw what happened and got out there and prevented some of that cutting. So that's a little story about my first book, Teaching the Trees, and then my second book, Among the Ancients. Since then, there's been a coffee table book, The Living Forest, and Treepedia that's here tonight, which is a fun, small little modern-day encyclopedia. But tonight, I really want to talk about nature's temples, and that's my brand new book that just got released. There was a version from 2016, but this is an update. It's an expanded version and published by Princeton University Press. So I'm so honored to be in Princeton talking about this book that was just released last month. Now that first book, when I wrote that and was really trying to reach the foresters, this one was different. This book was written for all the people across the country that are trying to save the forests themselves from the forest industry. Because so often there's a forest and it could be on your private land, it could be in your community, it could be your state lands, even federal lands. And people that haven't studied ecology and haven't been to school, and they think, oh, well, we should turn to the experts for how to manage this forest or what should be done to the forest, because we don't know anything about it, right? Your plumbing leaks, you call a plumber. Your car breaks down, you have a mechanic do it. You think, well, we'll call somebody in to advise us about our forest. But so often those forester advisors are advising to cut the forest because they're trained to think in terms of wood fiber for income. And it's hard to get them out of that, even when they're looking at public forests or even a private forest where you tell them you just want habitat. And the line that they often give is that forests must be managed to be healthy. And so people believe it if they don't know any better. And so as an ecologist, I decided to question that. So that's the whole premise of the book. Do forests have to be managed to be healthy? And what is the difference ecologically between a forest that's managed and a forest that's not managed? So years back, some people here are my age, we'd go in the library and we'd see this section of the journals, and it was kind of a scary section, like all these journals with all this dense stuff in there, and you didn't know what was in there, and you'd fall asleep if you tried to read it. And nowadays that information is all online if you can get it, or maybe there's a paywall to it, and it's all very confusing, this scientific information. But because of my background in being a university teacher and a scientist, I was comfortable with all that literature. I kind of like reading it. And so I dove in there and looked for any comparison between managed and unmanaged forests. And what did they find? Well, salamanders, you are going to find many more salamanders in the unmanaged forests. And that's not only just raw numbers of salamanders, but different types of salamanders. So to me, that would be an indicator of health. Also, tree age. You're going to find the oldest trees in the unmanaged forest. I think that's another indicator of health. Where are you going to find the tallest trees? That's going to be in an unmanaged forest. So unmanaged for a long time, that's what we mean by old growth. It's never been cut. Entomologists that study the insects in a forest found that there were many more beetles in the unmanaged old growth forest and many more types of beetles, species of beetles. And in fact, there were some insects, beetles, and caterpillars only found in the old growth forest. Only. That means if you cut that forest, you might be causing extinction of those species in that place. And the same with the snails. Like, who even thinks of the snails in a forest? But there was this young master's degree student in Kentucky, and he decided for his master's degree he was going to compare the snails in the managed forest and in the unmanaged forest. And he found indicator species in the unmanaged forest. This little tiny white one you see, this snail is about the size of a grain of sand, and it is only found in the old growth forest. Now, someone studying the lichens, particularly these calicoid lichens, which I had never even heard of, you need to use a magnifying glass to even see these things. And the researcher that made this his life's work found that in these managed forests that are younger, they're cut on rotation or they're thinned, you might find just one or two species. But in the very old forest, the unmanaged forest, you can find over 20 different species of these calicoid lichens. Now, these are the experts in their field. These are the rare people that have taken the time to study these things, but I think they're important lessons for us. Even plant diversity and cover, so wildflowers in the forest. Once you log a forest, you are destroying a lot of those wild plants, and it can take decades for them to return. And that's only if there's a forest nearby where seeds can be brought in or carried in, mostly by the ants. So this is a quote from one of the papers. Current forestry management is not conducive to long-term maintenance of bird diversity. That's the way the scientists would put it. And we often think when a forest gets cut, it'll recover, it's just going to take a really long time. But we have never seen complete recovery of the wild plant diversity in a forest, both before cut and after cut. Moss species. Some of you are familiar with Robin Wall Kimmerer, gathering moss and braiding sweetgrass. She's doing a lot of writing now, like I am, but she's also a scientist, and before she started writing those books for the popular audience, she was a scientist studying mosses, and she also studied the mosses in the older unmanaged forest compared to the younger forest, and found some moss species are only going to be in the old unmanaged forest. And that's probably because the bark on the trees gets thicker and thicker as the trees get older, and it holds more moisture. And the moss don't like to dry out completely. So the old growth forest is good for them. And if you love mushrooms, there are going to be more mushroom species in the older native forests than in the younger forest. And we are learning now about the relationship between the fungi and the tree roots. A lot of those mushrooms are the result of their underground threads, call them mycelia or hyphae, forming a relationship with the tree roots. Trees are passing sugars to the fungi for their energy. The fungi are passing minerals, they're passing water, they're passing amino acids with nitrogen to the trees. So they are helping each other. And then that, what we call the mushroom, when it pops up, that's just the fruiting body of that fungus. That's just the structure that's going to release the spores. But really the larger volume of the fungi is underground, depending on the trees. And it's interesting, when I first started doing this research in, it was about 2013, I think, when I started this research, about 10 years ago. And general audience had never even heard of Suzanne Simard. Nobody had. And now, how many of you have heard of Suzanne Simard, Finding the Mother Tree? Yeah, okay. So she's written a book this year about her scientific work documenting this relationship of not just the fungi with the trees, an individual tree, but the way the fungi connect trees not only of the same species, but different species. And the older a tree gets, the more other trees it's going to be connected to in that underground network. And that's what this circular green dots are supposed to show. The dark green dots are the oldest trees in that forest. These are all Douglas fir trees. So the lighter green, the younger the tree is. And they found that the oldest trees would be connected to 47 other trees in that forest. And the older trees can actually help out the younger trees. So even if we think we can walk into a forest and just selectively log, I'll just take that one, guess what? All the rest of those other trees are feeling it because they were connected to that other tree. We're just learning this. What else do we not know? Okay, so then there's the whole CO2 thing, right? Global forest area is declining. Let that sink in, right? You'd think we would be smart enough at some certain point to say stop, but no, it continues to decline. Globally, at the dawn of civilization, there was about 46% forest cover, and now we're down to 31% forest cover. And the United Nations monitors this, and every 5 years comes out with a report and tells us how much more forest cover we have lost. We've got to stop this if we have any brains at all. Okay, so here's global forest area declining. And then this other line is CO2 in the atmosphere increasing. Now, the CO2 increasing is not just because the forest is declining. We know it's mostly because of the fossil fuel burning. But the trees, the forests, make a difference in that. They are removing about a third of the extra CO2 from the fossil fuel burning a year. So we want to let them help and do their thing, but instead we're cutting forests, even if it's forest land that's going to grow back into trees and be forest again. Every cut release, not only are these trees not absorbing carbon dioxide, and it takes them about 20 years before they're even carbon positive again, because with every cut, the soil releases a lot of carbon dioxide. So that's how deforestation adds carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So we're not only stopping the removal, but we're adding to it. And there's some great science that shows that forest harvesting accounts for 85% of the forest carbon loss. So yes, there's windstorms, and there's tornadoes, and there's ice storms, and there's fires, and there's insects. And you can see this graph shows the darker red the color, the more carbon is being released. So this would be fire. On the right here, more active in the west, so windstorms, insects. But by far, harvesting that we have control over. We don't have to do the level of forest harvesting that we're doing. So in summary then, this book is showing the science and telling stories to make it palatable, but these are the cliff notes that in the older unmanaged forests, there's more carbon storage because those big old trees storing more carbon underground. Even the dead wood is storing more carbon, more salamanders, more lichens, more beetles, more fungi, more snails, more herbs. So which forest is the healthiest forest? Yes, the older unmanaged forests. Forests do not need to be managed to be healthy. So that's what this book is all about. And why is this important? This is important because we're not only increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we're losing biodiversity. And to an ecologist, this is even more of a sorrow, I would say, than the climate emergency, this loss of biodiversity. So we need to keep our older forests standing if we're going to protect our biodiversity, because 80% of terrestrial organisms depend on a forest ecosystem. So the forests are greatly important. So there's the story of old forests being important, but then what do we do about it? Yeah, they're important. We have to do more than just write books about it. We have to get out there and make a difference to try to save these forests. And sometimes it seems like, oh, well, those generations before us, why didn't they save more, right? Only 1% left? Really? Where were those activists? But now it's our turn. We've got to save that 1% and maybe save some forests that have been cut once and let them become old growth again, so that the next generation won't just be relating to forests through a screen or not have a place where they can visit and understand the forest. We need to have places not only because of the atmosphere and the biodiversity, but for humans, for our health, for our souls. And so by loving these forests, we will want to save them. So we need them also to create the next generation of activists. Because if we do our work and we save the Drew forests, like we're going to talk about, but then we're all going to be gone in 50 or 60 or 70 years, where's the next generation that's going to save Drew forests? So we have to do two things. We have to save the forests and we have to save a generation of people that are going to save them. So my... how I decided to do this, it can be a daunting task. Like, how do we save the forest? As a scientist, I think I like to break things down into manageable pieces. And so when I was out there on the road visiting these old growth forests for my book Among the Ancients, I thought, what if we could make sure that there's at least one forest in each county of the U.S. that's protected from logging, relatively accessible and open to the public. That way, no person's going to be too far from the forest. That way, children in each school district can visit one of these forests. And in the meantime, those forests will be improving the environment. So this idea came to me in a flash when I was on these trips and thought, yes, we'll do this. We'll call it the Old Growth Forest Network. And then I got home and I Googled counties in the U.S. and went, ooh, this is a big job. So then I had to start a 501c3 so I could get some financial help to do it. And we're about 12 years old now, and people have been very generously donating to us. I have a wonderful board of directors. Our staff has grown, and we are now doing it. We now have 200 forests, over 200 forests in the network in 34 different states. And we're just gaining momentum. We're putting more in every year. But it's even too big for that staff that's growing, and so we invite people to volunteer for us. So in each county, we look for what we call a county coordinator. And that's a volunteer that's going to look around their county and help us decide what is the oldest forest in your county that's protected from logging and open to the public that we can put in this network. And we take nominations from anyone. You can go on our website, which is here, oldgrowthforest.net, and make a nomination. Some counties we have a string of nominations for, some counties we have no nominations. So all the in yellow here, these are the counties that have nominations made, and actually Mercer County, where we are today, should be colored in yellow because there is a nomination there for the Mountain Lakes Nature Preserve. Is that the best one? We don't know. Our county coordinator has to get out there, talk to people, visit these forests, and tell us what she thinks. So Kiersey Basim is the volunteer county coordinator. Is Kiersey here? Okay, so county coordinators, and you can be a county coordinator for any county. You don't have to live there. So if you have a vacation home somewhere, you can be a county coordinator for that area. So far we have 2 forests that have been dedicated in New Jersey. Yay, it took us a while, but at least you're in the network, and we look forward to getting all the counties in the network, and we welcome your help. And if you're signed up on our list, and we know what state you live in, we'll send you an email anytime we're going to have a forest dedication, and then we'll usually do hikes through these forests, and it's just a great opportunity to celebrate these forests. So if you're interested in where the forests are, these 200 forests so far that are in the network, all open to the public, you just go to the forest button here and you look state by state. And there's a gentleman in the audience tonight that was telling me that he and his son, they travel and they check out our website and they go visit some of these forests, right? All open to the public. So we want people to visit these. And there's our donate button, very important. And this resource tab, we produce a lot of educational materials to, like, the health effects of the forest on humans that I mentioned, and I'm going to talk about a paper that I wrote recently, and you can also access that from this resources tab. So building this network of forests across the country has also given the Old Growth Forest Network a platform to speak out for threatened forests, or to speak out when we see things happening to forests that are just not right. And New Jersey has been on our radar because there is cutting going on in the state forest that should not be happening. It's heartbreaking, and I know people in this room are trying to stop it and doing their best. And we're building momentum, but we're not there yet. What they're doing is, so this is, I'm standing next to, these are oak trees that are 80 to 120 years old on a wildlife management area that was paid for by your tax dollars. You know, the green program, what's it called? Green Acres program, yeah. And so this was not an original untouched old growth forest. This was a second growth forest. It is, 120 years into recovery. And these beautiful old oak trees grow up there, and hickory trees, and maple trees, and beech trees. And it's an unfragmented forest. That's one of the important things about it. But then there's this mistaken notion that we're trying to understand that we need more open spaces for the creatures that like early successional habitat. And this really started with the hunting interest. The hunters like to hunt woodcock and quail and grouse that do best in open areas, and they're easier to hunt there. And so the hunting interests kind of merged forces, I don't want to say get in bed with, but that's what the expression, with the timber industry, who was anxious to cut these old trees so they could make money off of them. And all of a sudden we have these older forests that are being cut to create early successional habitat. And people are being told that this is a good thing, this is going to be for the health of the forest, that we don't have enough early successional habitat. But this is all bunk, and so we decided that we needed to shine the light on this, speak out against it. Yes, there are some bird species that like early successional habitat, but there are also bird species that like the old forests, and there's actually less of the old forest habitat in New Jersey than the early successional habitat. So here is the title of the paper we produced, Forest Clearing to Create Early Successional Habitats, Questionable Benefits and Significant Costs. And this is the first scientific paper that came out that said what's really going on here. And it's a massive thing. It's 53 pages long. It has hundreds of references. And I was thrilled that a couple weeks ago somebody did an article about it and called it an instant scientific paper classic. So being supported, being in the Old Growth Forest Network also gives me a platform to be able to do that sort of writing in addition to the books, to try to make a difference. And then we also like to pay attention to these threatened forests all over the country, right? So we're a national organization, so we can't really lead the charge on saving these forests ourselves, but we can draw attention to what is happening, and we can share the information on a larger platform, and we can also show up as a national group, the Old Growth Forest Network, and try to lend our weight to these local people that are trying to save the forests in their community. So we have some folks here from Save Drew Forest tonight, and Christine, could you tell us just briefly what's happening with Save Drew Forest? And
Christine, if you could wait for the mic, please.
Oh yeah, we'll get to the microphone.
Okay, I just want to point out, first of all, you can get all of the information, more than you would ever want, off of Save the Drew Forest website. All that information's back there. You can run your phone across it, you can sign a petition, you can get our newsletter monthly only. It's a very threatened forest. Drew University, like many small private universities, is in trouble financially and wants to maximize dollars from dirt, is how it's been put. They're after the Drew Forest, and why? I don't even live near there anymore. It's only 53 acres, which, we have a lot bigger tracts that we're saving in New Jersey. It's 53 acres in really a highly densely developed area, an expensive area of New Jersey. It is critical to water. What appeals to me as a kind of forest educator is 12 years ago, Drew, which kind of specializes in environmental science, that private forest was half fenced with a deer exclosure, 8 feet tall, and in the 12, 13 years since, a lot of work has been done, a lot of things have naturally come back. The bases were removed. It is the best place. There's a couple places you can go in New Jersey to see fence versus unfenced and what a forest looks like when the deer are not out of balance and stopping regeneration. If you go to Madison and walk into the Drew Forest, you see a full understory, shrubs and trees and spring ephemerals and all that. And it's just great for educating people and hopefully someday the DEP about the need to control deer.
Thank you. So we need to
Joan
save
has
that.
been our champion. She's really spoken out for the Drew Forest, which hopefully will become a community member of the network. Thanks.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Thank you. And right here in Princeton, there's Herrontown Woods people, and they're working to save the forests here. They're increasing the amount of protected forests, and this is a way of saying, this is how the Redwoods got saved. If you visited Muir Woods or any of the Redwoods, this was how it happened, because it wasn't going to happen otherwise. So the point is, we realize that these forests are important for so many reasons that I talked about today, but we've really got to stand together to save them. So when you hear of people working on saving a forest, join in there. Or if you see the forest near your community that's threatened, start asking questions, start making noise. We have all these separate forest groups. We're trying to link together. So I say we're more than a network of forests, we're a network of people that care about forests. So if you care about forests, get on our list and we'll let you know what's going on. It's a very exciting time right now for our federal forests. So President Biden, last year on Earth Day, last April, he came out with an executive order and said, I want my federal agencies, so that's U.S. Forest Service and BLM, to define old growth and to tell me how much old growth there is on our federal lands. Can you imagine? We've never done that before. We've never monitored our federal lands for what's old growth, and we've been cutting the old growth on the federal lands. He said, I'll give you 1 year. So this April on Earth Day, they came out with their documents, how much old growth was on the federal forests, and it was 18%. which is high. A lot of that, though, is pinyon pine juniper forest out west, which is an unmerchantable forest, and that's why it's still standing. That's why it's still old growth, because they couldn't really sell it. So now what is happening, so they have the definition, they have the numbers. Now both Forest Service and BLM, this is brand new stuff, have said, we want to hear from you people, everybody. What do you think we should do to protect these forests? So we are saying, when I say we, it's the Old Growth Forest Network, other groups, people who care, we are saying to the federal government, no cutting of our mature and old growth forests, and at least until the climate and biodiversity crisis is under control. And we're hoping to get 500,000 people writing in to Forest Service and BLM. So if you want to just add your name to a petition kind of thing, you can do that. You can find that, so if you're on our mailing list, we already sent you a link. So we sent one to everybody on our mailing list. But if you can't find it on Google, let me know and I'll hook you up with that. My email is joan@oldgrowthforest.net. So imagine if every person that cared about forests said to the federal government, yes, let's stick together. Let's save these federal old growth forests. So that's it, the Old Growth Forest Network, and thanks for listening, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you for coming and teaching us. What about the Pinelands in South Jersey? It's a protected area already with a lot of pine trees, obviously. They do controlled burns. How does that work? I thought that the controlled burns, they say they're necessary, but I guess all the wildlife burns up and the trees regrow.
So that's a very interesting question, and I don't feel like we have enough information about the prescribed burns. There's some forest ecologists that are, oh yeah, it's great, and they're all in favor of it, and some plant species come back after the burns. But then I asked other people, like this man that studied the snails in Kentucky, I said, well, what happens to the snails during a prescribed burn? And he said they all explode, die. And in Indiana recently, the state was doing prescribed burns in an older state forest, and people came in afterwards and there were dead box turtles, there were dead snakes, there were all kinds of dead animals, heartbreaking. So I don't think we really know enough to be doing the amount of prescribed burning that we're doing. That's my personal opinion. The Pinelands in New Jersey, so I would say nominate that. Maybe it's been nominated if it hasn't been. It's interesting because a lot of times when a forest is nominated and we think, oh yeah, it makes sense, this would be a good one, would be in the Old Growth Forest Network, and then we go and we ask exactly how is it protected. Often we find that it's not really protected. Like a lot of the state parks are not protected from cutting. People assume they are, but we're able to get that information out in the open and sometimes help with additional protections before things get in the open.
I read a pamphlet a number of years ago put out by, I think, Mass Audubon, and it had a kind of counterintuitive title called The Myth of the, you're familiar with that, the myth of the old forest, the point being that, at least in New England, every 125 to 150 years, there was a hurricane or something of that nature that effectively wiped out all the trees. And I just wonder how that fits into your thinking. And certainly they do happen. They were focused on the hurricane of 1938. When that does happen, are you then in favor of just letting it grow back, or what do you do?
Yes, so these landscapes with forests, they're not, just standing there and getting older every year. Things happen. Natural things happen. As I mentioned, hurricane. But the hurricane doesn't wipe out everything. It'll wipe out like a strip. Maybe it's thousands of acres, but if you have large habitat, it's not everything. There'll be some areas that'll escape and that will be older. Now where, let's say, a hurricane comes through and knocks down the trees, that's real early successional habitat. That's how we should have early successional habitat, and that is important for some creatures that do need the young forest. And yes, I'm in favor of leaving those trees there rather than salvage log, because what happens if you leave the trees there, you have a lot of that carbon that's in the wood that stays there in the forest, and then a lot of that goes down back into the soil, and all these organisms I'm talking about, the fungi and the salamanders and the moss species all benefit from that. But if you come in and say, well, that's a lot of money laying on the ground, we should clean it up, then you've got all that heavy equipment coming in, and it's taking out all that carbon, and it's disturbing that wildlife, so it's better to just let it recover on its own. The same with the burned forest. We're realizing how important that habitat can be to some species, the burned forest, so they should just be left alone. So now, it might sound like I don't think anything should be cut, and that's not really the truth. This podium's wood. Look at these beautiful wood walls. But I think there should be some forests that are our industrial crop forest. Maybe they're privately owned. We should not look at every forest, though, as a source of timber, especially our public forests. They have better uses. And only 5% of the wood taken from our federal forests is used domestically anyway. And when I look at how we treat the wood products, when I see buildings coming down and stuff going into the dumpsters, I think we could certainly save that 5% by just being more careful. So, just to sum up, the forests are a changeable place. Things are always happening, but usually there's a proportion of the forest that survives that and gets lucky. Like the article I just read today in Washington Post about a man that lived to be 109 years old. He said that was luck. And some of these forests get lucky too, and they stay standing for thousands of years.
Where's the 95% go?
Where's the
95% of the wood that's domestically?
No. So the federal. Sorry if that wasn't clear. We use only 5% of our domestic use comes from the federal forest. The 95% comes from these private industrial forests.
Hi. Congratulations on your new book. It sounds wonderful. I'm so excited to hear about the old growth forest network. There are several of us here from Herrontown Woods, and we work there every weekend. And we're specifically working on getting the invasive species out. I was wondering if you could speak a bit about invasive species and how that fits in with these protected forests, because it's so difficult, and I would love your viewpoint on that.
Yeah, the invasive species are a real challenge because they weren't a problem 50 years ago, right? As much. It seems like a new thing, and so then you have the old style of forest management that says, oh yeah, you come in and you cut this forest down and you let it regrow and do that every 40 or 50 years. Well, back in the day, you could do that and you wouldn't have all the invasive species. Now, you cut down a forest, it's automatically going to be filled with invasive species, or even thinning it out. And that's not taken into account when these foresters are saying, oh, you need to thin this out and cut it. So by keeping the forest intact, it helps to prevent the invasion from those species. Also, when I walk through an old growth forest, normally as I get deeper into it, if it's a large enough forest, I'll get to areas with no invasive species whatsoever, because the native plants are all occupying all the habitat niches, and there's no room for the invasive species to come in. But you can have protected forests now that are regrowing, and they're near seed sources of invasive species, and they can start to take over your forest. So then what do? For these forests in the old growth forest network, we really don't prescribed that they have to remove the invasives. You know, it's a good idea to remove the invasives, but then sometimes people don't have the staff to do that, and then they want to just say, oh, well, we give up. So we'd rather have the forest intact there with invasives than to not have the forest protected there at all. So usually people have to find their own balance. And the science is still evolving on this too. Recently I read a paper about garlic mustard, and they said when you pull the garlic mustard, you're actually increasing the amount of it you're going to have in the future because of the roots that are left behind will sprout. So keeping the canopy intact in the shade is the best way to prevent it. So thanks for the work you do, and I know that you're also interested in expanding forests. You're trying to save 2 other forests around Princeton, right? And you have this idea of are you calling it the green necklace?
Emerald necklace.
Emerald necklace. Yeah, I love that. Every community should be protecting the forests around it for all these reasons. Thank you for your work.
I want to thank you for all the work you've done. It has inspired me to see a different forest I would have never known. And I might be getting ahead of myself because there's so much work to be done in saving the old growth forest. But I'm also concerned about the land around the old growth forest and some of the places where I know when I was up in Ithaca, it was just beautiful stand outside of the town that's been saved, and we walk through there. And there's still open land around it, but there's more fields and some other road growth. And I just wonder, at some point, I guess there's also going to have to be some work to kind of protect the land around the old growth forest. Is that something that can even be kind of embraced yet? Or, I mean,
Yeah.
especially with water
Right.
and the streams coming into it, I feel like, that's going to be a really necessary part of everything that's going on.
Yeah, it would be wonderful to create buffers around these forests, and the conservation biologists say the bigger the better as far as species. The more area you have, the more species you're going to have. There's a direct relationship. So I think that might be your organization to create buffers around all these old growth forests. It's a little big for us. I think we're going to stop there and just do what you can. It's going to take all of us. So thank you for educating yourselves, and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. And also remember that you can buy her books from Labyrinth and get them signed. Thank you.